Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Mark Trahant, the editor of Indian Country Today. Indian Country Today has been a vital news source in Indian Country for nearly 40 years. It started as a weekly newspaper and is now a digital platform that recently added newscasts. Mark is a member of Idaho's Shoshone-Bannock tribe and a former president of the Native American Journalists Association. He has a lengthy career as a journalist and a professor. Mark, thanks for being with us. We're really just days away from the U.S. federal election, and it seems like every U.S. election is billed as the most important of our time, but just how important is this one?
It's always billed that way, you're right. The most important election of our time. But this time, there's a sense of urgency and of division. The urgency is that so many decisions are being made so quickly that the chance for the country to kind of slow down and take pause. But the second thing is that partisan divide is about as bitter and rancor as any time since the U.S. Civil War. So you've got people who literally willing to kill for their side, which I think is really a different sense of an election.
It is. There is some scary talk for sure out there about, the President Trump has already been talking about how things are going to be rigged or there's going to be widespread fraud. Is there a concern that he might not accept a loss here?
Well, yeah, and I think one of the things that plays into that is this election will have more people voting by mail than at any point ever in history. And we know from the states that have vote by mail that election results will not happen on election night. So in Washington, for example, it can take up to 3 weeks for the actual numbers to get certified. And that could cause all kinds of opportunity for mischief. Mm-hmm. It could be that one candidate has the lead on election night, and then 2 weeks later someone else does, and then 3 weeks later someone else does. And in between each stop, there's going to be court challenges and fights, and it could be really ugly.
What is at stake here for Indian Country in this election?
It's pretty significant on both sides. On the Democrat side, Indian Country has a stake in trying to get more across-the-board sovereignty and support for things like violence against women. Jurisdiction is a big play for Democrats, where tribes would have the ultimate authority to decide within their governance structure. With Republicans, it'd be energy development and energy above all. Tribes would be great partners if they have coal reserves or other natural resources. But across the board, it's a lot tougher, particularly for jurisdiction. Where the Republicans are really tough on tribes is on Indian child welfare issues. They almost always come down on the side of states and of taking away children, for example, from their families.
Mark, what has the last 4 years of the Trump presidency meant for Indian Country?
It's been chaotic, but that's kind of true of the whole country. There have been some success stories. I think very limited entry into missing and murdered women program with the Justice Department looking at it is probably their strongest success. The biggest one is that the previous administration, the Obama administration, was so devoted to pointing people across the board. So there'd be, for example, the solicitor for all of the Department of Interior was Native American. And this time around, Native jobs only go to Native positions, and there's just not much wide view of how government can be a partner with tribes.
You mentioned the murdered and missing Indigenous women. There was an announcement by Trump. Did that come as a surprise, and is it enough? There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of funding behind that initiative.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of funding. It was a surprise, but folks are willing to take baby steps to get started. Yes, there's not a lot of funding. There's some really sharp attorneys working on it. It's a good thing. The Tulsa, the District of Northern Oklahoma U.S. Attorney has taken this on personally. He's a Choctaw citizen and engaged. That's the good side. But funding is a big issue, and jurisdiction is a big issue. Tribes think the more they have a say, the more they're able to make some of these happen, particularly when it involves crimes between Indians and non-Indians.
Trump approved two very controversial pipelines in his first week in the White House. He's mocked Indigenous people, used hateful language, but there was also a targeted effort to make it very hard for some tribes to vote. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, they've really tightened up the voting rules across the United States, and it's impacted tribes. First of all, vote by mail is problematic, which is something that both Democrats and Republicans are fighting for. But tribes are in tough shape. For example, on the Navajo Nation, some of the post offices are 100 miles away, and so the idea of vote by mail is really complicated. Plus, you have multiple families. Most of the voting rights groups say that the best thing is vote by mail plus other things like ballot collection on the reservation and additional measures. They're also big on IDs and trying to crack down on who has legitimate reasons to vote. Felon voters are in some states really more of an issue than others, which impacts a lot of people that get hooked up with a crime when they're really young and has nothing to do with who they are as adults, but it still shows up in their record and they can't vote as a result. And then trying to recruit new voters and get them registered is often an issue where the state mechanism just goes through to make sure that it doesn't happen. One really egregious case right now here in Arizona is involving the Pasco Yaqui tribe and an Arizona county, which is refusing to have a polling station on the reservation. And the county clerk actually sent a letter to tribal leaders that was mocking and we can't do this just for you poor children type of thing. It was really ridiculous.
This was a pretty big issue, at least in 2016 for the congressional vote. Are all these things still in play again for this coming vote?
Yes, I think this, so we elected 4 members of Congress 2 years ago, 2 Native Democrats and 2 Native Republicans. This time there's 13 running for the U.S. House and Senate, which is a record. And one of the more interesting ones, in Indian Country Today, we include all Indigenous voices. So we include Native Hawaiians. And in the 2nd District of Hawaii, there's an independent running as an Indigenous candidate, a Democrat running as the party nominee who's Native Hawaiian, and a Republican who's running as Native Hawaiian. So of the 3 candidates, you're guaranteed there will be a Native Hawaiian. There are 121 Native American candidates running across the United States in races from state legislatures to Congress. Probably the most interesting big race is in Idaho, and that's Paulette Jordan is running for the United States Senate. She's a Coeur d'Alene citizen, and she had run for governor before and very prominent.
Our last few federal elections here have seen record numbers of Indigenous people running for office as well. What does that say to you to be seeing these high numbers this time?
I think it says that there's a role in participation, being in government in a way that allows you to participate and have some say. For example, the work that Deb Haaland and Sharice Davids did, who were just elected last time, has been just important. And they've been at the right committee meetings. They've stopped bills that were bad from happening. And the same with Tom Cole on the Republican side. In fact, the original Violence Against Women Act would not have happened except Tom Cole, as a Republican leader, reached out to Democrats and found middle ground. And I think that's where you see the significance of Native American candidates is, one, stopping bad bills early, but also finding common ground in order to get solutions moving forward.
The flip side of all of that, at least here, is, those who don't want to participate at all and feel that that's not their system. Is that the case as well for yourselves? And how do you see turnout coming out this time?
Here in the States, it is an issue. Some tribes particularly are very adamant that they shouldn't participate in the U.S. system. Others articulate the idea that it's better to be at the table than on the menu and work in that regard. Voting turnout is always an issue, but it's always higher in presidential years. One cool thing in 2 states, New Mexico and Montana, Native Americans actually have a higher voting percentage than non-Indians. So the work of a lot of people has paid off. In fact, Montana is really a great story because Montana has a higher or is about the same number of Native citizens as it does legislative seats. And so it's about 7% for both. And that's really having a say. And you've already seen it play out. One of the things they did in Montana early on was what they call Indian Education for All, where they argued that legislatively all citizens of the state should have access to Indian history. And so it's taught to every citizen in the state as basically your basic citizenship course.
Mark, we're going to talk a bit more about the election and a bit about what Indian Country Today has going on, but we've got to step aside for a quick break. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Mark Trahant, the editor of Indian Country Today. And Mark, we were talking about, the number of Indigenous people who are running for office this time around, and there's Republicans and Democrats. There are voices who support Trump. I mean, we had a prominent leader from the Navajo Nation speak at the Republican convention. Have there been achievements that, have people in Indian country wanting to vote for Trump?
I think the strongest argument that the Republicans make is for jobs and natural resource development. If you think it's important to develop coal and gas and oil and to have pipelines, then you probably are for Trump. If you think that this is a moment where the world is changing and climate change is becoming more significant, then you'd probably go in the other direction. The two big leaders that have endorsed Trump, Navajo Vice President Myron Leiser and the Crow Tribal Chairman, AJ Not Afraid, both of them are very much in the extractive industry model. Crow is a big developer of coal.
What are some of the issues that Indian country is going to want addressed by whoever receives a four-year mandate here?
I think climate change is at the top of the list. You're seeing more communities that are going to have to be relocated. Probably the most significant is the village of Tahola on the Quinault Reservation in Washington State. The tribe has been involved with a multi-year process of moving that village to higher ground to protect against storm surges. In Alaska, you're seeing several villages that are having to move significant distances because of climate change, as well as Louisiana. But you're also going to see that start to play out even more so with fire and other natural disasters based on the changing climate.
Well, Mark, we spoke with you back in April near the beginning of the pandemic. Like you say, this is the first time you've been in your office since March. The Navajo Nation, as we knew then, was being really hit hard. What is the latest with the pandemic within Indian country?
Indian country still seems to have hot spots across the United States, and we watch those pretty closely. I do think one story that's emerged since then that's really cool is that Indian country has been a leader in how it's handled this. The Navajo Nation that you mentioned, Dennis, has been really the model. They've got very effective shutdowns. They have 48-hour shutdowns on weekends. They're very aggressive about who's seeing who on the reservation. And as a result, they actually had a day recently where they had 0 new infections and 0 deaths. And that's really tribal leadership in action. Other tribes have shut down for the rest of the year. So tribes, unlike many states, are taking this pretty seriously. Mm-hmm. And I think it's partly because we've been through pandemics before and know the result of that, whether it be 1919 or even something more recent.
Many First Nations here initially went into lockdown and they kept the numbers down, but have somewhat reopened now, and we're seeing their first cases being reported. School has restarted. We're heading into flu season. What are you expecting there for this the next few months?
Yeah, unfortunately, from what we hear, until there's a really high both vaccine rate and people who've had the disease with enough antibodies to not carry it, we're not going to get much relief. And you look back in 1919, and I've spent a lot of time reading how that pandemic impacted tribal communities. And it really was a 2-year battle, and I think we're in that same sort of model. One of the things that's just as stunning today is if you look at those folks that face influenza, and even with the history of influenza and how we know it's worked, the vaccine rate is only 40% at best. Most places it's around 30%. So it shows you how far we're going to have to go to get to 70%, which is what's needed to really put this pandemic at rest.
Mark, having looked into the pandemic of 1919, are there other lessons that you've learned through there that we could use now?
The big one is the economy, trying to figure out ways to get the economy started again. And tribal communities were really poor in 1919, much poorer than they are now. And you saw waves of starvation and other things that were really bleak. And so this time around, having government step in, both tribal government and federal and state governments, and make sure there are resources to keep people fed during really bleak times, I think is essential.
The Trump administration initially announced $8 billion in funding for tribes for COVID relief, although the money was tied up in the courts. Has that begun to flow?
It has begun to flow, but it's still a mess. One of the things the Trump administration has said is they want tribes to spend it all this year. And to put it in context, that's the most the United States has ever spent on tribes, is $8 billion. Oh. And to spend it all in a few months is really challenging for a small community. And you've got people trying to figure out, well, is this a good expense? Can we spend it on this? And can we give it to our citizens? All these questions that have to be answered really fast. So figuring out a longer term solution, I think, is going to be important. The first relief bill also didn't do enough to help kind of the broader sectors outside of tribal government, such as enterprises. I mean, we know in this country that tourism and casinos have become, hotels have become a huge industry, and they're just never going to be the same again. I mean, the idea of being in a crowded restaurant or bar or even casino is just not going to happen for a long time.
It is one of those scary thoughts that you think of a place you don't really want to visit. Tribes, like you say, are feeling the financial crunch despite that funding. Are they going to be ready for a second wave if we're even out of the first?
That's a really good question. I think they will on the medical side, because the tribes, for the most part, have been very thoughtful. They've listened to science. They've kind of done the steps required. Not every tribe, but by far the majority. On the economic side, there's going to have to be some help. And it's going to have to be the same for states. Tribes are in no worse shape than states. States' budgets are going to just really collapse as you look at the number of people that are now needing support for health insurance and other things because their jobs have disappeared.
Interesting stuff. Mark, we're going to talk more, as I said, about what Indian Country Today is up to. We're going to step aside for another quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Mark Trahant.
This is Indian Country Today.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us. The Indian Country Today headlines for April 17th. The state of Oklahoma and 5 of the state's tribes have reached an agreement to work together on jurisdictional issues.
Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Mark Trahant, the editor of Indian Country Today. And Indian Country Today has been providing news and voices in many different forms over the years, for almost 40 years, from print to web, and that now includes a newscast. Mark, can you tell us a bit about why a newscast was something that you wanted to pursue?
Sure. So Indian Country Today is 40 years old next year, and as you said, it's gone through many different forms, from magazines to print. It was dark 3 years ago. They brought us back to revive it, and we first focused on digital, primarily the mobile phone, and that's just grown like leaps and bounds. In fact, last month we had our record traffic of 1.25 million unique users, which is pretty incredible. We decided, 2 years ago on election night, we decided to do what you do every election year, and that is to have an election night with reporters online across the country. And that was so successful the next morning that folks started saying, what now? What can we do again? And we decided, well, let's just see if there's room for broadcast. And immediately started calling around, and Arizona State University immediately said, why don't you bring your operation here? And they offered us office space and studio, and that kind of began the process. We had thought we were going to do a weekly show, and that was kind of the planning. The pandemic hit, and we started to do daily COVID reports. And on Zoom, we noticed the audience kept growing for that and decided, you know what, we should just plunge in and do a daily newscast. And that's where we're doing it. We have far too few people, but Indian Country Today has grown from 3 people to 20 in less than 3 years.
Wow.
And we think with broadcast, we're going to double in size again. And we have one of the stories you hear visiting tribal communities often is how much talent there is. And what I really love about this whole project is being able to say to that talent, come work for us, do something, help make this story out, get the story out together.
You know, we hear a lot about job losses in the media and how it's shrinking, but you're talking about expanding, and you know, how exciting is that, I guess, for you right now, and how needed is that coverage of Native American issues in the United States?
It's amazing. And so most of my career was mainstream journalism, and you'd, one, have to explain to an editor why it was a story. We don't have to do that anymore. We just do it. And the second thing is that the media was so reluctant to really let people in. It was fight every time to get one more position. And they'd say, we have to find people. They're not out there. We'll post and there'll be no applicants. And here we don't have any problem hiring. The talent is there. We just have to open up the platform for it. The response from readers is amazing. I don't think I've been in any job where folks thank me more often for what I do. And they'll call up just out of the blue and say, you know, election night, for example, this young woman in northern Minnesota called up and said, this was the first night of my life where I actually saw television for me. And I think that's a really powerful idea and something that we work to encourage.
I guess, you know, like you said, Indian Country Today went black there for a little bit, and now you're seeing these record numbers. Does that speak to the need out there for this type of coverage?
Yeah, I don't think you can know the United States story without knowing how Native Americans play into that story and how significant. And one of the things that amazes me is that we debate about a history that's 200 years old instead of talking about a history that's 10,000 years old. And as we look at climate change and some of these other significant issues, we're going to need that much longer tail of story in order to make sense of it all. My ancestors, Shoshone, once hunted mastodon, and they've gone through climate change. And so those kind of narratives over time, I think, are going to become really important as we try to figure out how to make sense in a changing world.
Mark, you know, election night's almost upon us. What can viewers, readers expect from Indian Country Today on election night?
We'll be doing a live broadcast again. It'll be on at 8 o'clock Mountain Time, which is in Phoenix, for 2 hours. We're not going to go the full 5 hours this year, only because recognizing how many elections will be by mail, we know that there's not going to be final answers. But we'll have a good look at all 120 plus candidates who are running across the country on Native citizens.
If it goes 5 hours, we're all going to be lucky if that happens. Mark, it's great work that you guys are doing down there, and a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
And that is all the time we have for this week. You can find more about this and all of our other episodes that you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. All of our shows, including this one, are available as podcasts. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you back here next week.